Hi, this is David Jones with the North Carolina Forest Service. The Water Resources Committee also knows me as the Yeti Master, or whatever clever nickname Grice can come up with. Lakel, if you'll partake in one on my behalf this year, I'd appreciate it. Sorry I can't be with you guys this year, but I did want to share with you a method we've been using for about the last 4 months to identify forest harvest sites using Landsat satellite imagery. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, it would be helpful to briefly go back to school and highlight some of the basic components of remote sensing and kind of the technology that this method relies on. And I'm by no means an expert on the subject, so hopefully I don't give you some misinformation, but I think this will be helpful in the long run. So what is remote sensing? Well, it's the acquisition of information about an object or phenomenon without making physical contact with the object. So in some simple terms, you can think about humans as having a few remote sensors of their own. We have eyes and a nose and ears that all sense information without being in direct contact with it. In modern times, we've come up with some pretty sophisticated technologies, and generally remote sensing in this day and age refers to the use of aerial sensors to detect and classify objects on Earth, both on the surface, in the atmosphere, and in the oceans. But all of these are examples of some modern day technologies that represent a remote sensor that collects information. And all of this technology really relies on the physics and the fundamentals of the electromagnetic spectrum. So this is just a picture I pulled off the web that illustrates the electromagnetic spectrum, and along the top here there are some examples of the size, I guess, or the scale of the wavelengths and frequencies along the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the things that we're most familiar with, of course, are the visible portions of the spectrum, the red, greens, and blues. And those common satellites for Earth observation are focused around this portion of the spectrum, picking up the visible and into the infrared and portions of the thermal. So that's really what most sensors that we're pulling data from rely on, in particular Landsat and the MODIS sensors that are mounted on the Terra and Aqua satellites. So how does this all work? One thing that folks get mixed up on are passive and active sensors. A passive sensor reads what it gets at the sensor itself, which is what most satellite technologies utilize. An active sensor would be, an example of that would be LiDAR, where things are shot from the sensor to the object they wish to record information on, and then they read what is sent back in return. So in the modern sense, for satellites, the sensors measure radiance at the sensor itself, and not necessarily the surface reflectance from the target. So in other words, the sensor is only measuring the intensity of light when it hits the detector surface, or hence the sensor on the satellite. And the units for this measurement are typically watts per steradian meter squared. So another way to look at this from a Earth observing satellite standpoint is just imagine that the satellite is out or in orbit around Earth, traveling about 17,000 miles per hour, and its sensor is designed to look down and record data that it receives at the sensor itself within a number of ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum. So it covers the visible portion of the spectrum, the blue, green, and red, and then they commonly, Landsat in particular, covers near infrared, shortwave IR, and then for one reason or another they jump up to thermal. They normally have that on range 6, and then jump back down to grab another shortwave IR. So another way to look at this would be to just imagine that your agency's radio engineer is up there on the satellite in orbit around Earth, traveling again at about 17,000 miles per hour, looking down, asking the question, within a given wavelength range, what are the watts per steradian meter squared? So that's just another way to think about it. So another common point of confusion is understanding the difference between the satellite and the sensor itself. Sometimes these the names are the same, and oftentimes they're different. Using the human body as an example, you can think of the satellite as, you know, the human body, or it's often termed the platform, and the sensor would be the instruments on board that do the sensing. So in our case, the apparatus or instrument that does the sensing would be our eyes, our nose, and our ears. So one example of how that works for common Earth observing satellites would be the Terra satellite, which has on board 5 sensors, MODIS being one of those sensors, which is what, of course, the forewarn system relies on. Example for that would be Landsat 7 and 8 has a slightly different sensor setup, but 7 and 5 both relied on the sensor technology of thematic mapper or the enhanced thematic mapper in the case of the Landsat 7. So another point of confusion for some folks when talking about remote sensing is the term bands. Of course, when we're talking about bands, we're not talking about these, but instead we're talking about these, which refer to those wavelength ranges that I mentioned earlier. So in essence, a band is one of those wavelength ranges for which the satellite sensor is designed to look at the watts per steradian squared and so forth. So this is actually Landsat 8. It has 11 bands from the visible spectrum at the top to the thermal infrared side of the electromagnetic spectrum at the bottom. These are the 11 bands that are available with Landsat 8. So really that concludes the remote sensing 101 class. So you know, we can break from that and get to the nuts and bolts of what North Carolina has been doing for the last several months to find harvest sites for BMP implementation monitoring. So we really wanted to know, can active and recently closed forest harvest sites be identified using a relatively simple methodology, publicly available satellite imagery, and other collateral GIS datasets? And investigating that was to start with a literature review to look at the various methods that are out there to detect changes in forest cover from satellite imagery. And this is just probably a subset of the methods that are out there. The normalized difference vegetation index is one that's very commonly used, and it's what Forewarn relies on using the MODIS data. The normalized difference moisture index is another method that Arkansas had some luck with in the past to locate harvest sites, and then there's various other methods. TM here refers, it's an abbreviation for the thematic mapper, so the Landsat data, Landsat 5 and 7, and most of these methods utilize more than one of those bands, more than one of those wavelength ranges products that are generated. So each of those bands is actually an individual TIFF image that you can get from the online viewers. So the one that we had the most success with testing all of these out with various software was fortunately one of those methods that only utilizes one band. So we really don't need to pay much attention to all of the other bands. We're able to find harvest sites just using bands. And this is a schematic of kind of the analysis process that we use to get to where we're looking at what we believe to be our forest harvest sites. And so you need just one band, so in our case band 7, and you need 2 time periods of that same location, that same scene. And Landsat 7 does have some issues with it. You can see those black streaks in the upper 2 left-hand images. Those black streaks are essentially a blind spot on the sensor. It had a malfunction several years into its orbit, and obviously there's no easy way to get up there and repair it, so that malfunction persists, and it essentially results in a blind spot, so that there's no good data viewed on the Earth's surface for certain areas of that scene. So the first thing you need to do is take those bad data out, those black lines, which is what we've done on the right, upper hand right. And then once you've done that, you're ready to basically subtract the 2 images, and this is of course done in GIS, and you take the second time period and subtract the first from it. And through field evaluation and testing and checking some things out over aerial imagery, we identified values greater than or equal to 20 as values that identify notable change in vegetation. So then our next step is to just pull out those values, 20 and greater, from this subtraction. And then you're basically looking at all areas of vegetation change. So this could be forest, this could be an agricultural field, this could be somebody's decent-sized lawn, or just a pasture. So you need to filter that down, if you will, to areas that are only on forest. So we have put together a couple of different versions of a forest land mask for our state, and we intersect these 2 things to make sure that the vegetation change that we're looking at is occurring on a forest. And then from that you get the bottom left-hand picture, and all of those areas in red depict areas of forest, notable forest vegetation change, which in our case is removal. If you go the other way, it could be afforestation if you looked at some of the values on the other end of the spectrum, so to speak. And then the last thing we do is try to mask out that product a little bit more based on some collateral data, and this is some stuff that we're still working on. We're trying to put together some statewide data for where forestry practices are expected to occur on a parcel level based on whether that landowner is enrolled in a tax program and so forth and so on. So you can whittle that down even further, then you'll know for sure that you're looking at a forestry tract versus one that might be land clearing or some other form of forest vegetation removal. So that's in essence. So when we take this method and look at how we did in the field, we're really having a lot of success. If you look at this picture here, all the areas with red splotches, those are the areas that the satellite change detection process identified as vegetation change, or more specifically forest cover change. And the yellow arrows of course are pointing to corresponding photos taken on the ground of those locations. So we're having a lot of success identifying clear cuts, but also partial harvesting. The bottom picture of course shows a thinning of a pine stand, loblolly stand, probably first or second thinning. Hard to tell from the picture, might be an overdue first thinning. So as you can see, we're having a lot of success. One place there's certainly a lot of room for improvement is with the collateral data. As you can see on the middle right hand side of the image, there's a red splotch adjacent to a mining operation. And of course, if we had a better forest land cover mask or some parcel data that helped inform what that change was, for instance, if the parcel was clearly noted in ownership as being a corporation or an LLC with mining in its title, then we would know that's a mining operation clearing and not forestry operation. So the most room for improvement occurs with collateral data, and the satellite analysis is really doing an excellent job finding these locations. So folks with some younger kids might appreciate this reference a little more, but to get back to the question of whether active and recently closed harvest sites can be identified using satellite imagery and GIS data sets, all of which that are free and publicly available. The answer to that question is a resounding yes, it can, and we're having a good bit of success with that here in North Carolina. So what we're working on right now is automating this analysis methodology as much as we can using Python programming, which is a language that interfaces well with GIS technology. What we have working so far to go online to the RSS feed, essentially the digital news feed that says when there's new scenes available, and we look through all of those scenes that can be upwards of 400 scenes a day. We look through all those and try to find ones that are in our state, and some of those 400 scenes, they could be from across the earth and not something we're interested in downloading. So we look through that to find the ones that are in our state. We pull those scene IDs down, as well as some attribute information like the cloud cover percentage into a local file, and from that we can create text files with those scene IDs to download the data batch from the USGS FTP. And the reason that's important is because currently the common viewers that they have online, Globus and Earth Explorer primarily, don't let you download as many scenes as you want at one time. Normally it's restricted to 2 scenes at a time, so you'd have to queue up 2 scenes, let them download, and then queue up 2 more. So with this tool of being able to generate the scenes into a file and then upload that, it utilizes their batch data downloader utility, and you can get as many of those downloaded at one time without having to continually go back online. And once we get those files saved on the server, they come in a compressed, what's called a tar file. It's just another format of a zip file. We're able to go into those compressed files and pull out the things we need, primarily the band 7 TIFF image, and place that on the server. And then from that we can perform the analysis and intersecting it with some collateral overlays. So we're looking at what we believe to be our forest harvest areas. The thing that we're working on without a set timeline or deadline is to package these tools into an easy user interface, and so this is still very much under construction. As it stands, we can easily communicate with states what we've got and how it works, and give you what we have, but it would probably require Water Resource Committee folks to interface with their GIS folks within their agency or within their groups, because it will require a little bit of GIS familiarity to get it working. So one question that may be on your minds is why not use Forewarn? If you recall, that is something we were looking into and trying to use Forewarn to identify these forest harvest sites for BMP implementation monitoring, and we did explore that option with the Southern Research Station. But the question, the long story short of that, is that Forewarn relies on the MODIS sensor, which you could say roughly draws on the landscape with a crayon, and you might go so far as to say draw on the landscape with a pretty dull crayon. Whereas the methodology we've been using in North Carolina that uses Landsat satellites, Landsat 7 enhanced thematic mapper, and 8 the OLI sensor, is much more like drawing on the landscape with a fine colored pencil. Of that here in North Carolina, these images are a little bit hard to see, but I'll try to explain what you're looking at. The backdrop is an aerial photograph. The big blocky colors would be the MODIS data from Forewarn, and the smaller red, bright red, blocky data is from the Landsat analysis. And the data in the MODIS, the bigger pixels, that's closer to red, would indicate a vegetation change. So this is one example in North Carolina. You can see that a lot of the MODIS data overlaps area that are not that's not forest. the forest land mask they have to use, it looks at the majority pixel representation, so you can get quite a bit of noise with the forewarned MODIS data, and in some cases, it's there's a pixel down to the bottom right that's pretty much exclusively agriculture and looks like some homes and a roadway, and there's actually, I think, 0 forest in that pixel. So there's a lot of noise there, and so, that can be a problem. So each of these examples I'll go through briefly. You see a little bit of noise in the Landsat as well. You see those red dots to the eastern right-hand side of this picture. We get picked up a little bit of noise in some ag fields and pasture lands, and that goes back to having a good forest land cover mask. But at a 30-meter pixel resolution, which is what the Landsat little red dots are, it's much finer than the 250-meter, which is roughly, one of these big MODIS cells is roughly equivalent to 13 acres. There's another example. You see the MODIS, it's kind of a broad brush, and the Landsat is painting with that finer point. Yet another example, you'll see kind of some comparisons of what's going on. This is a coastal county in North Carolina, some activity in some bays, and the other thing to note is that sometimes this vegetation change in the forest is not a harvesting activity. We've picked up several fires, and in one instance we actually located, without corresponding with the field, we were able to locate where they were putting in prescribed fire lines, our local staff. So one question that came up when working with Hughes in Texas and testing out this method, see if it would work in some other states, was was Landsat 7 really worth downloading with these, it's the scan line correction malfunction on the instrument, so these black diagonal lines that don't have any data. And in my opinion, it's definitely worth downloading, because the total scene area of an individual scene is over 7.8 million acres, and the disrupted area, or the area that doesn't have any good data of that entire scene, would be about 2.4% of the scene. By the time you combine 2 images, say one image from today and an image from 16 days from now or 16 days earlier, to do an analysis, sometimes those areas don't overlap perfectly and they're offset by a little. By the time you combine the 2 images, those 2 periods, you're only losing 9.2% of the scene. So you have left over good data of over 7 million acres. Those black lines are about 570 feet thick and about 2,500 feet apart. So to me, to have an area of over 7 million acres of good data to analyze, as long as it's cloud free, is very much worth downloading. In North Carolina, that's somewhere between 7 and 10 county areas. So you're getting to analyze that large an area all at one time. To me, that means Landsat 7 is still worth using. So with that said, I think we have an opportunity ahead of us that it'd certainly be worth considering. I hope to hear back from Tom and Gail that the conversation was lively, and hopefully there's some support for the idea of putting this analysis methodology into a regional improvement project and getting it done at the regional level, so that each state is provided notification essentially from a GIS system that's hosted on the cloud somewhere. They get notification by email or however whatever means that we decide is the best way to do it, of harvest sites in their states. And the thing I want to accentuate here is this. I don't think this is a far-reaching project. It may seem like the technology is complicated and cloud hosting this and that, and this is too big an undertaking, but this is really not a difficult project to get done. I don't think it's a pie in the sky sort of concept. In fact, I would argue that it's more like a pie eating contest, and all 13 states could be happily eating from the table. With Virginia off to the side here, partway cut off, because they have a harvest notification system, so maybe they have less to benefit from this sort of thing being implemented at the regional level, but they could still use it to identify where individuals may be avoiding the notification law in their case. And I'd really like to think that before Grice heads out the door, that he might latch onto this project and think it's a good one, and be willing to help put together this regional improvement project. So the project could be essentially a Landsat forest change detection tool set for the southern region, and we could get it started by using the Band 7 methodology that North Carolina is using just to find harvest locations. But we could build on to this over time, so long as it's constructed appropriately from the beginning, to incorporate other things. I mean, Landsat data can be used for any number of other things. Several bands and methods exist to look at, identify locations on the landscape where fire is occurring, insect damage, and so forth and so on. Pretty much everything that the feds have used Forewarn to date on the Landsat product could be used as well. Only, again, we're drawing with that much finer colored pencil. And in North Carolina, I've already started to kind of put a name to this thing, and this is certainly up for discussion. But the Landsat Forest Change Tools could be a project that we get funded. And I know the big question on most everyone's minds are, well, what's that going to run us? And I think a reasonable estimate would be somewhere between $350,000 and $450,000. I think kind of the magic number of keeping it under $500,000 is a good idea for a regional improvement project, and I think we can easily do that with this project. So in closing, I hope you'll have a lively discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. And the last thing I want to say, since I have the stage, is that hopefully there's some lively discussion about what is going to be done when Grice retires. I hear that might be sooner than later. Hopefully the feds have in mind to backfill his position, and if not, or even if so, hopefully the Water Resources Committee is staying engaged with the feds on who might get in that position, and hopefully we don't lose direction and find ourselves up the creek without a paddle when Grice retires. So anyways, hope you guys are all doing well. Take care.